Let's talk £140. On the weekend we saw Terence Crawford versus Thomas Dulorme. We saw Matthysse versus Ruslan Provodnikov. Recently we saw Danny Garcia versus Lamont Peterson. It's fair to say that within the last month a lot of the big names within that division have been active and have been fighting each other. I know there's some debate as to whether Garcia and Peterson should even be classed as light welterweights, whether they've got future at that division, etc. But for the purpose of this video, let's include them in the picture. They are reigning champs at the weight. Whether that means anything or not is perhaps subject for another division. What I'm seeing at present is a lack of strength in depth in this division. I think it's arguable we've seen the top 4 fighters fight in the last month. We saw Danny Garcia, who I believe won his fight versus Lamont Peterson. We saw him getting horribly danced around. He wasn't able to land on Lamont Peterson. What he did bring was aggression and activity, which can be commended to an extent. But he looked really poor. And he looked like any sort of slick, defensively minded, moving boxer with sort of amateur pedigree and technical skill could get the job done against him. I would suggest they perhaps need a higher punching output than Lamont Peterson, but nevertheless. We saw Lamont Peterson active. Now, he performed with credit against Danny Garcia. I felt he didn't have enough punch output in order to justify winning the fight. But regardless, Lamont Peterson, he's a solid enough fighter, but no world beater. No world beater whatsoever. He's a guy himself who can be outboxed. Just because of his recent performance against Danny Garcia, we shouldn't forget how he looked in the early rounds against Amir Khan. This is a guy who is not impossible to get outboxed. This is a guy who got stopped very early by Matthysse. In my opinion, it's hard to consider Lamont Peterson right at the very top of the sport, despite losing with credit to Danny Garcia. Then we've got Matthysse, a guy who struggles against boxers, a guy who has been beaten in the past by the likes of Devon Alexander, the Zab Judah fight. He's a guy who struggled against boxers and faded badly in the fight with Ruslan Provodnikov. He did deserve to win, in my opinion, but nevertheless, he looked far from the complete fighter in that fight. For me, he's got one of those classic things where he can punch very hard, but there's almost a certain vulnerability about him. And you've got Provodnikov, a guy whose idea of defence is trying to break an opponent's hand on his chin. This is a guy with no defence, no jab, no boxing capability whatsoever. My point is, in many ways, the top 4 established 140-pound guys are all beatable. And for me, the way to beat them is similar. I would suggest that Danny Garcia, Lamont Peterson, Matthysse and Ruslan Provodnikov would all get beaten by Tim Bradley if he was still able to make £140. I would suggest that all of those guys would be vulnerable to a Kell Brook if he was able to make £140. A fighter like Erislandi Lara, I just think would have too much for these guys. Too much skill, too much pedigree, too much technique. Now, recently in the £140 division, that fighter hasn't existed. But we saw that person come into the fray and actually win a world title this weekend, as far as I'm concerned. Terence Crawford, who captured the WBO belt by defeating Thomas Dulorme. Now, Crawford lost the early rounds. He wasn't active enough. But he still impressed me with his defensive movement and his tight sort of fundamentals. He's able to show, he was up against Thomas Dulorme, who's a boxer, if you like, a skilled boxer, not a world beater, but nonetheless a credible boxer, a credible opponent, a guy who's big at the weight. And for me, Crawford didn't look like a 135-pounder in there. He looked solid at 140. He clearly carries punching power at the weight, dropping Dulorme several times en route to a mid-round stoppage. And for me, this guy has got the style to absolutely dominate at 140. He can move, he can box, he's got a jab, he's got defence. I mean, put simply, if he fought Ruslan Provodnikov, I think he'd have a similar blueprint to Chris Algieri in terms of getting the job done. But I'd say this guy has skill and amateur pedigree and sort of that kind of technical amateur style that is leagues above Chris Algieri. You know, his technique is leagues above Chris Algieri. His power is leagues above Chris Algieri. His defence is leagues above Chris Algieri. You look at the success Devon Alexander had against Matthysse, and I know that fight's controversial, but nonetheless, you know, this is a guy who is leagues above Alexander, leagues above Chris Algieri. And then you look at the success Lamont Peterson had against Danny Garcia, you know. I mean, like Lamont Peterson, perhaps Terence Crawford isn't the fastest starter. We saw him lose early rounds against Dulorme, we saw that in the Gamboa fight. But unlike Lamont Peterson, he's able to pick it up. And I think he's got the ability to hurt an opponent and to win big rounds that I don't think Lamont Peterson necessarily displayed. For me, Terence Crawford is just a really advanced all-round fighter. Versatile, you know. He's a power-punching boxer who can move and is equally well-versed in offensive and defensive boxing. He can throw combinations, he can fight on the inside, he can punch to the body, he's got excellent punch variety. I really like him, I really like him. He's fast becoming, in my opinion, in the talent stakes, a pound-for-pound contender. Yeah, for me, he really is a complete fighter. I agree maybe he doesn't have the personality or the charisma and sort of story of a Floyd Mayweather type boxer, but I personally think that this guy has the ability to go right to the top of the pound-for-pound list and stay there for quite some time. And I think the 140-pound division is right for him to run through at the minute. For me, it's hard to see any of those guys having a shot against him. You know, look at how vulnerable those four guys who represent the top of 140. How vulnerable are they to a mover? You know, how vulnerable are they to a really technical boxer? How defensively open are they? How vulnerable to a double jab are they? Yeah, for me, Terence Crawford walks through them, and as long as he can stay defensively sound, you know, he's got nothing to worry about. And I think 140, we may even see best of him at 140. Maybe he was draining too much weight to get down for 135. Adrien Broner, the problem, is another one to throw into the mix. People hate Adrien Broner. I get that. His personality, some of the things he says, some of the things he does. People mock him for how he performed against Marcus Maidana. But let's not forget, this is a guy who moved up from, you know, like super featherweight or something like that. I forget what exact class it was, to welterweight. Very, very rapidly. You know, essentially, he moved up too much too soon. Let's put that to one side. He lost to a top 10 welterweight and he's not a welterweight. Let's consider him as a 140-pounder. For me, Adrien Broner has got a lot to like. I mean, even in that beating to Marcus Maidana, he showed great heart and great chin to keep coming and keep fighting. He showed that he's not an easy man to stop. You know, he's got boxing fundamentals, defensive capability, well above the top four in the 140 division as I see it. I mean, look at his domination, the absolute domination of John Molina in comparison to the effectiveness of John Molina against Lucas Matthysse. And the other thing I took from that is the output from Adrien Broner. I've always thought of Adrien Broner as a low volume, low output kind of guy. But I saw an increase in offence from Broner when he fought John Molina. I saw a more effective jab from Broner. I saw more volume coming from him. And if he can keep that up, if he can perhaps keep his discipline and stop ballooning up in weight so much, he is a real threat at 140. I mean, these two guys, Broner and Crawford, skill-wise, represent the top of the division. Right now, there is no one at 140 pounds I would take over Adrien Broner and Terence Crawford. I really see them both handling Danny Garcia, Lucas Matthysse, Lamont Peterson and Ruslan Provodnikov with consummate ease. Consummate ease. There is nobody who I see giving them problems. The guys at 140, and I've done videos on this before, it is odd how you seem to get groups of fighters who fight in the same fashion at different divisions. Like at 154, you've got Lara, Trout, Andrade, Charlo, you know. You get groups of fighters who are similar. It's the same with these guys like Provodnikov, Matthysse, Garcia. These guys who don't jab, these guys who don't move, they throw hooks, you know, they brawl. It's different kettle of fish when you throw in someone like Terence Crawford, someone like Adrien Broner, who's got a defence, who's got, you know, I know Adrien Broner isn't much of a mover, but this is a guy with real fundamentals, you know, high defence, you know, shoulder roll, jabbing. Sometimes that's all you need if you're going up against a guy as crude and as defensively open as Ruslan Provodnikov. And combined with Broner's chin and heart, I think he can go a long way at 140. I think these two guys are there to absolutely run through it. I haven't done post-fight vids specifically for this weekend's fights, but let's put it this way. Crawford, Dulorme, Provodnikov, Matthysse, Garcia, Lamont Peterson, out of those 6 fighters, can you really say that any of their upside, you know, obviously Crawford's got the highest upside, but who's got the second highest upside? You know, none of those guys, to me, are going to be dominant champions in the sport for years to come. There just isn't. There's too many flaws to their game. My serious picks, if Adrien Broner can sort his life out, come in at 140. And if Terence Crawford can stay at 140 and keep putting on performances like that, I don't see these two guys getting beaten unless they decide to fight each other, of course. Let me know your thoughts. Keen to discuss, keen to hear your thoughts on the fights this weekend. Thanks for watching.